Everyone, welcome back. Today I wanted to begin our last unit of the semester taking a look at modernism. And I'm going to divide modernism into two parts. The first part is going to be before World War I, and part two is going to be after World War I. And what we're going to see is a lot of the ideas and the thoughts, the intellectual developments that's happening before World War I that we're going to take a look at today are only going to be seemingly proven true by World War I. And we'll take a look at this new vision of humanity. I just want to kind of start by saying that the closer that we get to the modern world and to our contemporary life, the more radical these ideas are going to start to seem. And so the closer we get to our life in the 21st century, the more people are going to have opposition to some of these ideas, because these philosophers in true humanistic fashion are seeking to, quote unquote, liberate the mind, and they're challenging past ideas. And the more that gets to our world, the more we feel uncomfortable with it. But hopefully we can kind of approach this with these ideas with an open mind, seeing where the philosophers and artists are coming from, to see why they're changing art, why it looks so different as we see here with Picasso and Kandinsky's art, why it starts to look differently, and start to see how they're trying to envision the world that they see to be changing. But also, hopefully, this will kind of give us a little bit more appreciation and retrospect for the radical ideas of the past that we've studied that we now take for granted. Things like democracy, right? Things that were radical at one point, but now it seem commonplace. Or things like questioning the authority of the Pope seemed pretty radical during the Reformation, but today it just seems like Tuesday or whatever the case may be. Or the idea of free will that Mirandola argues was radical in its day. And so these ideas, as they start to shift humanity and shift the way that we see ourselves, they do become commonplace. And so the closer we come to these radical shifts, the more we're going to feel less comfortable, right? Today I want to take a look at, picking up where we left off before, some of the political and industrial revolution themes that we were covering during the Enlightenment and the Romantic period. I want to pick up with the Victorian era. The Victorian era just refers to Queen Victoria, who roughly lived in the 1800s until early 1900s. She actually had a pretty long life. But she has this kind of rigidity about the way that society should function. And it starts to influence art and culture during that time period. And I would argue that the Victorian era is just kind of a continuation of Romanticism. It's kind of one of the subsets. And so part of Romanticism is the British Romantic poets. Some of it's the Gothic that we see with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Another part of that I would consider the Victorian era. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the Victorian era today to show you what modernism is going to be reacting to. So modernism is going to be kind of a reaction or a repudiation of the Victorian era. So let's take a look at some of these ideas. Just to define the Victorian era, right? It's a transitionary period between Romanticism and modernism. And so some people see it as a separate era. Some people see it as a continuation of it. I kind of see it more as a continuation of Romanticism, because you see a lot of similar ideas and themes during the Victorian era. It was named after Queen Victoria of England. The cultural manifestations such as art and literature focus on refined social manners and strict social mores. And so the Bronte sisters and Jane Austen and George Eliot are all going to be part of this particular era. Charles Dickens, Mark Twain are all kind of coming from this type of era. Even though Mark Twain's an American writer, he's still influenced by similar kind of artistic ideas that are coming from Europe. It's a period marked by destruction and reconstruction, and has an almost unyielding faith and hope in tomorrow. And so we're going to see that that tomorrow is going to be better, this kind of unbridled human development, right? Take a look at some of the past ideas that have influenced the Victorian era is first part is the political revolutions, right? The Victorians felt that they outgrew the Middle Ages. The Declaration of Independence was one of these indicators. It was the end of feudalism or feudal power. Although Queen Victoria was still predominantly, she's still there, right? What we see in England during the 1800s is her power starts to severely be restricted, right? People are pushing for a new form of government. Louis XIV's statement, "I am the state," is no longer the political objective during the 19th century. The government should serve the citizens, not just the citizens serve the state. And so these ideas of the American Revolution, the Declaration of Independence, and the Declaration of the Rights of Man in France suggest that there needs to be a control on power, and that rulers need to be able to be restrained, right? So we see these ideas starting to influence the European culture. And we see this happening within England with reform bills of 1832, 1867, and 1884, which were designed to promote equality. In 1832, the Parliament reformed a representative body to more equally represent the people rather than just the aristocracy. So more of a representative body of government rather than just, a very small portion of government given to the majority of the people. In 1867, there was greater access to voting for more people in England at a greater as people started to gain more wealth, they started pushing for more power. So the middle class started having the right to vote along with the wealthy. And in 1884, the Parliament changed to represent more of the agrarian farmers. And so what we see in England during this Victorian era is some traumatic political changes, and we'll talk about how that changes society. And in Germany, we see them following suit. So this isn't just happening in the United States and France and England. It's starting to affect all European countries. In Germany, what we see is the Reich, they start to unify Germany. They start to focus more on consolidating their nation, to build this idea of a national identity, and then starting to allow more people to have access to the legislative and political process. And so the main revolutions, right, the bloody revolutions are going to be the American Revolution, the French Revolution. But what we have is that these ideas start influencing other countries more in a peaceful way. That happens over several years. But this era was marked by a distinction from the past, right? It proves that the old system of feudalism is decaying. There's something new on the horizon. And so during the late 19th century, the feudal society and the agrarian world was replaced by democracy and urbanization. And taking a look at some of the major ideas, some of the major voices that start to articulate this change. One of them is John Stuart Mill, who argued about this idea of decaying feudalism. He says that people are no longer born into their place, but are free to choose their own faculties to achieve the most favorable lot. And so there's no longer any type of political restriction on what a person can do for a living, that you have to be a blacksmith or you have to be, some type of farmer. You can do whatever you choose. And so there's this idea of freedom, right? This idea of political freedom is now influencing social freedom, economic freedom. And so we see this change. Again, this is an idea that we take for granted today, but it's something that was pretty radical and new during the 19th century. And he talks about this kind of this uncertain future. He says that mankind has grown out of its old institutions and old doctrines and not yet acquired new ones. And so again, he's arguing that the Victorian era is, they're no longer in the past, and they realize that, but they're not really sure where they're going. And so there's this kind of certainty that we see, but also this underlining hope that tomorrow they're going to be able to figure things out. And so some of the main ideas that he asserts is that there are no political restrictions, right? That birthright means nothing, that success is really done through hard work, right? And so there's this idea of optimism, that humanity can do whatever it chooses. And this is going to be replaced a little bit later by more of the pessimism, or some would call realism, that's going to happen when the rubber meets the road in the 20th century, right? But here we see that humanity is no longer limited by its government, that there were no longer restrictions set upon a person to limit what he or she can do, right? Well, mainly he here. There's still a lot of restrictions on what she can do, but there's this feeling of transition, right? That is going to permeate throughout the Victorian era. One of the other changes that we're going to see is with the Industrial Revolution, right? The kind of the second wave of the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century, which builds upon this idea of political freedom, right? We have this idea of the bourgeoisie dream, which in the United States, we just call it the American dream, but because other countries aren't the United States, they don't call it the American dream, they call it the bourgeoisie dream. And so we see the kind of the cementing of this idea during the 19th century of the bourgeoisie dream. A couple of the effects of the bourgeoisie dream is that there's more of a focus on riches, right? This idea of if you can be whatever you want, right? You're not limited by your father, you're not limited by any type of political restrictions, then you should become better, right? So then you should be able to advance your political state. If there's no restrictions on you, then if you don't do it, then it's on you. And so there becomes this vehement hatred of poverty that since there is this feeling of freedom and this unlimited access to wealth, then if you are poor, it's because you have chosen to be poor. And so in some ways it's an oversimplification, right? Some people are in poverty because of other issues, whether it's social issues or psychological issues or whatever the case may be. It's oversimplified, but that's kind of how the Victorian world saw it. Since we are removing those kind of restrictions on you, then you should be more wealthy than your father was. And so each generation should get wealthier and wealthier was the idea. And if you're not wealthy, then you're just lazy, right? And so the two main goals during this era was for respectability and salvation, right? And so both of those were kind of intricately linked, right? So you're going to be respectable by becoming more wealthy because the focus is on wealth. Your net worth becomes extremely important. And the other one was you still want to work your way to heaven. But it's a similar kind of idea because you have to work your way to heaven through your industry, through thrift, and the idea that idle hands are the devil's play toy kind of thing. If you are lazy, if you are idle, you're not working your way to heaven. So you have to work. So there's an emphasis on industry, right? You need to be industrious. You need to be constantly working. The idea of leisure, the idea of vacations, this whole idea of the past where what we saw with the Rococo era, with people just kind of going off and having this idea of leisure and not working, right? Having other people work for you. You see that being condemned, right? So you see more of Voltaire's idea in Candide that everyone must work their garden, becoming more commonplace during the Victorian era, that we all need to be working. And so this is a complete repudiation of the feudal class that doesn't do anything, right? So today, if you take a look at the nobles in England, they keep themselves busy, right? They all have their own kind of nonprofit work that they're doing. They all have their own work within the government that they're doing. They've kind of assimilated this idea that they shouldn't be idle. They should be out there doing something. And also what we see is this complete faith in the business class. So the business class, the industry, right? They're industrious and they're therefore pious. Therefore, they are going to be the ones that save us, right? So this idea that business people are going to be the ones that we can kind of turn the keys of the government over to them, and they'll find the best way, the most economical, the most expedient, the most scientific way in order to rule. And we kind of have that today with electing business people, right? Business people do pretty well in politics. I don't know, maybe 2020, we're seeing a bit of a transition. Still a lot of uncertainty, at least at this point, about who won the election. But we see a lot of that faith that the business people are going to be the ones that are the smartest, the brightest. Because they got that money, they must be smarter and harder working, right? Is the underlying current that we continue to kind of adhere to during that's kind of kept this lingering element of the Victorian era. Taking a look at some of the books, right, that capture this idea, right? Charles Dickens is part of the Victorian era, and he's heavily influenced by these ideas. And in Great Expectations, we see the tales of a young orphan named Pip in England, who is raised from his who rises from his difficult childhood to become reasonably successful because of his industry. Even though you are poor, right? Even though Pip was poor, he's able to kind of rise above his circumstances, that bourgeoisie dream. Or we see similar ideas in Washington Irving's Rip Van Winkle, right? The story about a man who falls asleep and the world passes by. He wakes up and misses the Revolutionary War and his son's growth to childhood, right? The message is clear. Don't sleep your life away. Become industrious and make sure that you're working every single day, right? Or Emerson's, his book on self-reliance, right? This essay declares that humans should only rely on themselves. He mainly focuses on self-reliance of the mind. People should not rely on the ideas of others. We need to be able to think for ourselves. And so he kind of picks up that idea of Kant, right? This idea that we need to release ourselves from self-imposed tutelage and not rely on others. And what he also argues that people should work their own way in life rather than relying on the virtues or the graces of others. And so some of these ideas, we see these ideas assimilated within our culture, and we definitely see these ideas assimilated within the church culture, right? This idea that we need to work hard and we need to not accept help from others. We see that again and again, that, I hear stories all the time about people who, received help or were going to receive help that showed up to help them, chop firewood or whatever. And they said, nope, I can't do it. I'm not going to accept your help. I need to do this on my own. And so kind of interesting. We've kind of taken this to the extreme sometimes within church culture, that we only need to rely on ourselves. And then we have to think, well, wait a minute. Well, why do we have, other members? Why are we part of a ward if we're supposed to do everything on our own? And so in some ways, we've kind of taken this maybe in too far to some extent, and maybe need to kind of think about how, we can, right? We need to be self-reliant. That's true. But we also need to be able to find a balance within that. Taking a look at a couple examples of these ideas, just to kind of show you how we see these elements implemented within society. I want to take a look at Andrew Carnegie and J.D. Rockefeller. Both of them are examples of this idea of the bourgeoisie dream. Andrew Carnegie was born in Scotland, and he immigrated to the United States. And initially he worked in cotton, and then for Western Union as just kind of a sales clerk. But what happens is, in 1865, he opens his own steel company that was worth $480 million when he sold it to J.P. Morgan. And then to adjust that to inflation, that would be $8 billion in today's currency. And so someone that kind of comes from this obscurity and then rises up to be kind of a titan of industry. And then what he does after he sells his steel business, he then devotes the rest of his life to philanthropy and writing. And this is a quote from him. He says that he has a, quote, moral obligation to give to charity. And so one of the major things that he does to give to charity is he starts developing libraries so that people can have more access to books, to education, right? So building on this idea that we need, like this, self-reliance that we see with Emerson, we need to be able to think for ourselves. And so many of these small rural communities throughout the United States at the time didn't have access to libraries. And so he built them all over. And so he's built about 2,500 of them. And so most of the small towns in the United States that you go to, that there's a little tiny cute old library, that's probably, I would guess, 90% of the time, that's going to be a Carnegie library, right? They're all over, right? They're in Boise, they're in Idaho Falls, they're in Moscow, they're in Pocatello, they're in Salt Lake, right? They're pretty much everywhere. And then he also gives about $350 million to charity, which is, again, about $4.6 billion to charity. And so if there's this idea that these titans of industry, right, they're smart, they're industrious, they know what they're doing. And not only that, we can trust them to give back. And so this is something that's deeply rooted within American culture, right? J.D. Rockefeller is another example of this. He was born in rural New York His father was a farmer, and he initially worked as a produce clerk at the local grocery store. But then he develops a company that grosses $450,000 in the first year, and then he uses that to go into oil, and he opens Standard Oil, which at the time, with the locomotive developing and the automobiles just kind of, just a few decades out, this is where, this is where society is going, is in oil. And so he's going to land big, right? He totaled over $900 million dollars in 1913, which is about $1 trillion in today's currency. It's, it's phenomenal. But then he devotes the rest of his life to philanthropy, and so he becomes, by and large, one of the wealthiest people ever that has existed. But again, he starts to dedicate his life again to charity, to giving back. He gives 1/10 of his off the top to charity when he retires. And then he starts to develop schools, right? So similar to Carnegie, he believes that the giving back means education. If you're going to help people become self-reliant, you need to help them to be able to think for themselves, to develop the skill set that they need to be able to do so. And so he sets up schools. One of them is Rockefeller University in New York City. And then he sets up his own organization to find places to give money to. So he develops his own nonprofit organization. He gives $550 million, which I don't know what that would be in today's currency, but that was $550 million back in the early 1900s to charity, right? And, it's kind of interesting that these individuals kind of felt this moral obligation. And the question that we kind of think about as we apply this today is, do we see big business as saviors who are going to, find some way to give back to us? Or do we just see them as greedy, money hungry, kind of looking for their next payday, right? So, but this is kind of where this mindset really starts to take root, that we still kind of have permeating through our culture today. Another major revolution during this time, in addition to the political revolution and the economic revolution, the industrial revolution that we have the scientific revolution. That we see this idea of this utopia, that science is going to be this utopia. That there's this faith that science is going to save us from all the social ills, such as starvation, hunger. That we're going to find ways to make crop production so easily and accessible that anyone's going to be able to afford it, right? And so with time, these social ills will be gone. So there's this underlying faith in human progress, that this faith in mechanical conventions. All manufactured goods are going to promote conveniences to life that lead to, in their mind, happiness and perfection. So they're going to produce more goods and services, drop the price of them, and then they're going to end poverty, right, was the mindset. The advances in travel and communication were also big hallmarks of this time period. The locomotive and the telegraph were major developments, right? Such changes marked the scientific advancements. The locomotive made it more easily accessible to travel great distances in a shorter amount of time. In 1821, you have the first passenger train. In 1857, you have the first sleeping car. Which makes traveling a lot less dangerous, right? Before this, you had to travel on foot or horse, right? We see how dangerous a proposition that was for early members of the church to cross from Missouri all the way to Salt Lake, right? That was a long, laborious, painstaking process where a lot of people died along the way. Or you see the Donner Party is another extreme example of this. It was a risky adventure, right? Members of the church, as they were going off in the distance, kind of felt like they were going off into, a void, a vacuum. They had no idea what was out there. And so with the locomotive, you have this idea that it's no longer a risky, long, painstaking proposition. It's only going to take a couple of days to go from New York City to San Francisco. So it makes it a lot easier. And so greater distances seem as though it's really not anything. It seems as though the world is starting to shrink. And the same idea with the telegraph in 1840, and then the telephone was developed in 1876, which before this, messages were delivered on, horses, like the Pony Express, and it took several weeks to communicate because you have to wait for someone to go out there and then wait for them to return and come back. But this makes it almost instantaneous. And so there's this belief in this kind of optimism that because we can move farther faster, right? Because we can see the world seems like it's a smaller place. Because we can communicate more readily and more easily, we're heading in the right direction. That war, miscommunication, right? These are all problems of the past. The reason that we've had war in the past is because we weren't able to understand each other. And so now with the telegraph and the locomotive, certainly we can kind of alleviate those problems. So that is the underlining ideas that we see with the Victorian era, this idea of optimism. So what we see with the view of humanity during the Victorian era is very similar to how we see it within the church today, right? So there's a lot of correlation between the Victorian era and some of the ideas that we have in the church. Number one is this idea of creationism, right? Genesis, coming back to Genesis, Adam was created in the image of God. Therefore, we must have God-like attributes. God created the world in 7 days, and the world is only 6,000 years old, right? So these are some of the pinnacles of the Victorian mind. Also, we see this idea of human destiny, that humanity, because we're created in the image of God, we must have godlike qualities and we're destined to be good. We must be benevolent, virtuous, noble, this optimism that we were created for good. And so there's this feeling of hope, right? And so what we see with Whistler's Mother on the right, or Frederick Remington's The Fight on the left, is kind of this view of the Victorian mindset, right? Even both of these are coming from the United States, but they're capturing this era, this mindset of the 19th century. That with Whistler's Mother, we see this idea of this pious woman who's devout, focused, right? Can have this laser focus, and she's not necessarily focused on, leisure or luxury. She's someone that definitely works in her life and now is just posing for her son. But the focus, the emphasis here is on this idea of piety. And what we see within Frederick Remington's The Fight, we see people going out and fighting this idea of this, taking this unbridled virgin landscape of the Wild West and then taming it. And so this is humanity's restless spirit to tame the savage land. And so these are some of the hallmark ideas of the Victorian era that are then going to be questioned by some of the revolution, the intellectual revolution, right? Some of the main ideas. And as I've taught these ideas throughout, the last 15 to 20 years, I taught them in the South, and they called these the three great Satans. And so I don't know where you are with your feeling towards these individuals, but whether you agree with them or not, they change radically the way that humanity sees themselves in the modern world. And so you can't really understand modernism without understanding some of these intellectual changes. And so some of the ideas that we see happening is urbanization, right? And these are going to change how humanity sees themselves. And so as Europe and the United States start shifting from an agrarian culture to a industrial culture, we see the rise of urbanization. So I just want to show you the population growth happening in Paris, New York, and London. And I want you to think about what might be some underlying problems, right? So in 10 years, Paris grew by 33%, and then in 10 more years, another 13%. Another about 9 years, 27%. Another 10 years, 8%. And then by the end of the century, they have grown another 8%. And so they've gone from 1.2 million to almost triple that, 2.7 million in roughly 50 years. And I want you to think about what kind of strain is that going to have on a particular culture? In New York, we see in the 1840s, it was about 300,000, right? Pretty small area. But then 10 years later, you see an 84% increase to almost 600,000. And then 1860s, another 10 years, it grows by another 69%. And then another 10 years, 40%. And then another 10 years, 35%. And then by getting closer to the 20th century, it grows by another 36%. And then finally by 1900s, it's at 3.8 million. And so it grows by over 10 times in size. And so again, what are going to be some of the underlying problems that people are going to be confronted with? In London, we see similar growth trends happening, a 47% growth in about 20 years between 1840 and 1861, and then in 20 more years, another 36%, and then another 10 years, another 10% increase, and then by 1899, you see a 55%, another 55% increase. And so going from about 1.9 million to 6.5, so over 3 times the size. And so again, what problems might cause, right, with such a little amount of time passing, and then such a huge, tremendous population explosion, what are going to be some problems? And one way to think about this is to think about Rexburg, right? So what are some problems with, we have continually more and more students adding to campus, and what are going to be some problems that you guys face in Rexburg, right? Number one is going to be finding housing, right? What's going to happen to housing when there is a huge demand and low supply, right? The law of supply and demand suggests that when there is a large demand and low supply, the prices go up. And so what's going to happen in these areas is there's going to be a tremendous amount of increase in housing. And so there's going to be a housing shortage, and so housing is going to be really expensive. And so what you're going to have is you're going to have a lot of people living in a very small amount of space. And so one family can't afford an apartment on their own. They actually have to bring in boarders. They have to bring in multiple families. And so in one area in London, for instance, you have about 230 or so people living in a small little kind of apartment complex there. It just seems as though it's just the apartment complexes are bursting at the seams during this time. Another problem that you're going to have is with sanitation, all these people in a small area. You're going to have disease starting to spread. Another problem that we have that you can kind of think about in relation to Rexburg, when there's a lot of people here, there's not going to be a lot of jobs. And so jobs become really scarce. And so the amount of money people are being paid, right? If you if you're an employer and you have a lot of people to choose from, you can pay lower and lower prices. And so that's exactly what's happening. And there's a gulf, right, between with the escalating apartment prices and the decreasing wage. There's this gap, right? And this is where we have Karl Marx, right? Karl Marx, who was initially in Germany. He starts writing these ideas, and he's eventually kicked out of Germany, right? Writer for a Cologne paper, and he lives in Paris, and he kind of makes some interesting arguments I wanted to take a look at, but eventually he's expelled from both Paris and Germany, and he starts focusing on England and what's happening with this rapid urbanization and some of these problems as we start moving towards capitalism. And so just to think about, I wanted to take a look at this idea here and whether this idea is true. And this is questioning the idea of the 18th century, this idea of the American Revolution, the French Revolution, of what they're fighting for. They're fighting for democracy. And he argues that true democracy is only achieved through a classless society, right? So if we have like a large upper class and a large or a small upper class and a large lower class, right? He's suggesting that you're not really going to have true democracy. And I want you to think about whether you agree with that idea, right? So I want you to think about this as we go through the United States, right? We're going to apply these ideas and see whether they stick or not. George Washington, adjusted for inflation, had a net worth of $525 million. Thomas Jefferson had a net worth of $212 million. JFK had a net worth of about $1 billion, and it's interesting, his father, Joe Kennedy, got his money from bootlegging in the 1930s, and so that's where the Kennedy dynasty kind of begins. But he's, at the time, he was the wealthiest president ever, right? Bill Clinton had a net worth of $38 million. GW had a net worth of $20 million. Barack Obama had a net worth of $5 million. And then Donald Trump has a net worth of, 3.5 million. We don't really know because he doesn't really release his tax information. And so my question to you is that true, right? Is Marx right? Whether you agree with, a lot of his ideas or you like him or not, Is it true that we cannot have a true democracy, right? Do we have a true democracy in the United States, right? If our politicians are mainly from the wealthy, are the needs of the poor and the middle class being truly addressed, right? So if everyone's coming from the same class, is it feasible that people at the lower class can people that are in power really identify with the needs of those at the lower class, right? So something to maybe think about: could an average Joe who is kind of a blue collar worker actually rise up to become president of the United States, right? Would that actually happen, or do you need this kind of infinite amount of resources to be able to become president or even senator or congressman? And I have another chart that I don't have in this slide, but if you take a look at our elected representatives, it's all coming from the same class. They're all multi-millionaires. And so the question is true democracy only achieved through a classless society? All right, can we have true democracy with both wealthy and poor citizens? Marx says no, but I don't know where you are within that. Maybe you have some different ideas to add to the discussion. I want to mainly take a look at his Manifesto of the Communist Party. And what he argues within this is he says that history can be divided into four main epochs. Two of them have already happened, and two of them he's predicting will happen, right? What he argues is initially there was the epoch of feudalism, where trade guilds regulate the market, and the guild is like a trade union. And so in the old days, if you were, let's say, a leather worker, you would enter into the leather guild, and then the guild would tell you how much you could produce and how much you can sell it for. And they also determine who gets to be a leather maker, right? Or if you're a carpenter, you could be in a carpenter guild, or if you were a cloth maker, you can go into a cloth making guild, right? But each industry had its own guild that had a strict regulation on the market. The only real guild that we have today is probably the American Medical Association, right? And they kind of function in a similar way. The American Medical Association gets to decide which medical schools open, right? And they get to say, okay, you're going to have a medical school or you're not going to have a medical school. And so in that way, what they're doing is they're regulating how many doctors are out there in the market. And what that does is it regulates the price of doctors. They regulate how much doctors can make. Because if every school was able to have a medical school, then everyone would go to, I don't know if everyone would, but a lot more people would become doctors. And if there's a lot more doctors out there, then the cost of medical procedures would plummet, right? And so by controlling the amount of schools, right, the American Medical Association functions as a medieval guild. Well, what happens with capitalism is the first thing that business people want to eliminate are the guilds, because the guilds start to regulate what can be produced and how much it can be produced. And if you're in the industry, you want to make more products to outsell your competition. So you want to make more shirts if you're in the cloth making guild so that you can lower the price. And so if you have a lower price, you can sell more shirts and you can then defeat the competition, right? This is Walmart's business model, right? If we sell in volume, we can lower the price and then we can kill the competition. And that's exactly what happens with capitalism, is they destroy the guilds, right? And during capitalism, we see more of an emphasis on private property. Profit benefits the individual. Consumer demands determine the price for the product. So rather than guilds determine it, let's let the consumers determine how much they're going to spend, whether they want to spend this or not. And then labor is paid the minimum wage to increase profits. And so you're going to pay your workers the lowest possible sum that you can, so that you can, if you're the business owner, so you can maximize your profits. But they still do support freedom of religion during this particular era. But what he argues, right, and we're going to take a look at some of his, in depth of his argument. He argues that during this time, the society is simplified into two camps. The bourgeoisies, the business class, this would be where Warren Buffett and Bill Gates are. And then the proletariat, these are the workers. And so mainly what capitalism does is it simplifies society into the haves and the have-nots, those that are part of the industry that have money and those that do not. He argues that this system is going to become so extreme, and this is what he's examining in London with people that are being paid such low wages, but yet the rent's so high, this isn't going to last, right? So he says that eventually people are going to push to change capitalism and to find more mechanisms to control the economy, right? During socialism, profits are shared with the public. All citizens have access to public needs such as food, shelter, education, healthcare, although that healthcare he doesn't mention, that's more of a contemporary concern, with the belief that this benefits society as a whole. The more people that can be educated, the more people that have food, the stronger a society is. If we have mass systemic poverty, it's only going to weigh down society. And so he's arguing that we need to change that. Two types of property, he says. There's individual and then there's community property. So there still is individual property, but there's also this emphasis on community property, such as he's suggesting that businesses should start to lean more towards being seen as communal services rather than individual services. And so things like utilities, water, electric, right? These are already moving towards more community-based services. Or the question that we have today is whether the internet should be a community-based service, since it's much like electricity. It's something that we need to function within the modern world. And during this time, there's still a maintaining of the freedom of religion. During communism, what we have is more of the abolishment of private property, right? So there is no more private property. There's only state property that is then given to people. All production is for the state and redistributed by the government. Equality is ensured by strong centralized government. And then religion is abolished because in his mind, religion, he calls it, quote unquote, the opiate of the masses. But he argues that religion becomes corrupted. And so that's why he argues that religion is restrained. But these are kind of this is kind of an overview of what he's arguing. There's a lot of people that have very strong opinions about Marx. Mainly, we see that there are some societies during the 20th century that try out communism. It generally doesn't work because all of that property is given to the centralized government. And as we tend to find, right, that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That the natural man takes over, and then you have autocrats and you have tyrants. And so generally, because there's such a centralized focus on one person, then that one person or that one group becomes more problematic and more restricting on power, and so you have tyranny. But I want to take a look at his commentary on capitalism. I wanted to examine whether he has some truth to these ideas. He says, the bourgeoisie, wherever it got the upper hand, put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors, right? So this idea of bloodlines, capitalism said, well, I don't care about bloodlines. I just care about how much you work and how industrious you are, right? And there's left nothing between man and man than naked self-interest and callous cash payment. And so in some ways, the benefit is that we no longer have bloodlines and we can kind of determine our own, right, success. But he says on the other hand of this, right, the other dark side is that all we have then is our net worth, and that's what we're defined on, based on. Now, I want you to think whether that's true, right? Are we only defined based on our net worth, right? And before you immediately say, no, that's ridiculous, right, where we all have individual worth, right? I want you to think about that, right? If you were to say to someone on campus what your major is, right, that's the first question we generally ask within a campus community. What's your major? To get to know someone. But that major tells us something about that person, right? So if someone says, I'm pre-med, that says something about that person. If someone says, I am a theater major or a music major or whatever the case may be, right, that has a different connotation to it. And the reason for this is because we do tend to see people based on their net worth, and we tend to value them, right? I know several people who value their spouses because their spouses is in the medical community or a lawyer or whatever the case may be. They kind of see that as a badge because they see that net worth says something more, right? I'm worth a little bit more than you, therefore I'm more valued within this society. So there are some positive changes that capitalism introduces, and there's some negative changes that we see. And a lot of times as I go through these ideas, people get a little bit grumpy with me because they say, well, if you're critiquing capitalism at all, you must be, I don't know, of the devil or whatever the case may be. But I wonder if there are ways that we can improve, right? I mean, it's not, I don't know if, Heavenly Father's necessarily a capitalist up there having stock in Apple and Google and whatnot. maybe there are better ways that we can function as a society. But the propaganda, the push, the mindset is that this is the best way, right? Well, maybe it is. Maybe there's something else. And let's take a look at his criticism. But the question is, can we criticize capitalism, right? Can we find, what's wrong with it so that we can improve it? In proportion as the bourgeoisie, i.e. capital, is developed, in the same proportion as the proletariat, the working class, right? The modern working class developed, a class of laborers who live only so long as they find work. These laborers who must sell themselves piecemeal are a commodity, right? So they're reduced, their humanity is reduced into what product they can produce, like any other article of commerce, and are consequently exposed to all the vicissitudes of competition and the fluctuation of the market. And so when the market is down, right, we say, okay, the market's down, so it's time to buy real estate. Well, when the market's down to buy real estate, then the lower class, they're also down. They're being laid off. They're losing their job. They're, getting pay cuts at work. And so they're down as well. So they're exposed to the fluctuation of the market, whereas the bourgeoisies, they can then move into a particular area and buy out the downturned market and the real estate there. And then they can wait for that to be able to then recover, and then they can sell at a profit, right? So, but the proletariat doesn't have that, right? They're more kind of tuned into whatever's happening within the market. So that's another problem. That's one of the problems with the proletariat. Another problem is, owing to the extensive use of machinery in the division of labor, the work of proletarians has lost all individual character and consequently all charm for the workman. He becomes an appendage of the machine, as only the most simple and monotonous and most easily acquired knack that is required of him. And so what he suggests here is that the proletariat becomes a machine, in just kind of a cog in the wheel. And so if you're thinking about a factory, right? Well, factory workers mainly just do one thing all day long, right? They just kind of do a repeated motion. And even if we kind of take this into Walmart, right? A cashier at Walmart is kind of doing the same thing all day long. And so in a way, they just become kind of a machine. And the reason for this is because if that Walmart worker or that factory worker quits, they can then find someone else easily to replace them, kind of insert them into this particular area. And the mechanism, the industry doesn't slow down. You don't need this specialized skills. You need someone with unspecialized skills. And so another part of this is that you see the proletariat losing humanity, becoming a machine. And in fact, what he also argues is that the workman loses control over the product. If you are, for instance, if you are an automobile worker working and creating cars all day, you don't control that car anymore, right? All you control is the fact that you show up for work and then you get paid for it. And so in the old days, he argues, right, there was the charm of the workman. If you were a carpenter and you made a chair, that chair was yours. You got to determine, right, when it was sold or how much it was sold for to a certain extent. And so he suggests that the workers today, we lose all that. We lose our ability to have power over our own labor. And that's another problem, right? That's another dehumanization problem of capitalism. Another thing that he argues is the bourgeoisie draws all, even the most barbarian nations, into civilization. The cheap prices of commodities are heavy artillery with which it batters down all Chinese walls, with which it forces all the barbarian, intensely obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate. And so the bourgeoisies don't just want to take over its own country. It wants to expand its resources, expand its capital, expand the market, and go into everywhere, right? It wants to fill the world and create a world after its own image, right? He says, it compels all nations on the pain of extinction to adopt the bourgeoisie mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization in their midst, right? Their civilization is capitalism. To become bourgeoisies themselves in a word, it creates a world after its own image. And so the reason why we go into these developing countries or majority world countries is because we're seeking, number one, their resources, whether it's their natural resources or the resources of labor. And what we do is we try to make them into capitalists. Let's take a look at whether, capitalism does work, right? Is there a problem with wealth distribution in our country? This is the United States here. As you can see, from 1917 to 2008, the top 5% have grown in their wealth, whereas the median income is pretty much flatlined over the last 100 or so years. And so we take a look at the chart on the right-hand side, the growth of the CEO pay, right? We see them going from the 1960s to 2008. We see them continually getting wealthier and wealthier. So they're getting about 250 to 300%, what the average worker gets. And so the question that you would have with this is, why do they get paid so much? Why do CEOs get paid so much? Are they working 300 or 200 times more than a worker? Are they 200 times smarter? Maybe, I don't know, but that's the question that we need to perhaps ask as we move forward. Another systemic problems that we see, right, with this growing gulf, some of the problems that we see is how people are treated, if people are treated equally or not. And we see some of this tension happening with George Floyd or Rayshard Brooks, where we see certain individuals within the socioeconomic groups are being disproportionately affected in a negative way by the current system. And so, does the system, is it equal to everyone? Is there this sense of equality, or does capitalism build this widening gulf between those who have and those who haven't? And that's what Marx is arguing, is that really capitalism really starts to create more and more of a divide. And we see that again with COVID, right? How, and this article focuses on how COVID is affecting the lower classes more than the upper classes, right? The upper classes can actually social distance. The lower classes actually have to go into these industries, what do they call them? They call them, what's the word that we've been using? Necessary industries. I can't remember what the word is. But they're going in and risking their own health on a daily basis for lower wages and also for lesser health care. And so we can see with COVID how this is affecting these lower classes. And so, again, getting back to modernism, how we start to see this influencing people or these groups is we see, number one, we see a displacement. We see people that are leaving their agrarian communities and they are going into the cities. And as they go into the cities, they're leaving their towns that they've lived in, their families lived in for centuries, to go to become part of these different communities. They're surrounded by strangers, and a lot of times they don't speak the language, and so there's a lot of feeling of estrangement within this particular community. We also see the growing effects of child labor during the 19th century, and so this Victorian world that has this faith and optimism, we see some very difficult themes emerging during this time. William Blake, who we took a look at with The Lamb, who is a British Romantic poet, examines this in what is called the chimney sweeper. And a chimney sweeper here are little children. Because children are small, they can go into chimneys easier to clean them. I want to just read through this with you to get a sense of William Blake is examining these changes and these problems, right? So there's a lot of good that's happening with industrial revolution changes, but there's a lot of negativity, right? All things have their opposites. When my mother died, I was very young. My father sold me when yet my tongue could scarcely weep, 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 weep. So your chimneys I sweep, and in soot I sleep. There's little Tom Dacker, who cried when his head that curled like a lamb's back was shaved. So I said, "Hush, Tom, never mind it, for when your head's bare, you know the soot cannot spoil your white hair." So he was quiet, and that very night, as Tom was sleeping, he had such a sight that thousands of sweepers, Dick, Joe, Ned, and Jack, were all of them locked up in their coffins black. And then angel came by an angel who had a bright key, and opened the coffins and set them all free. Then down a green plain, leaping and laughing, they run and wash in the river and shine in the sun. And so this idea that this angel sets them all free so they can actually be children, right? But it's only a dream, right? Then naked and white, their bags left behind, they rise upon clouds and sport in the wind. And little angel told Tom he'd be a good boy, he'd have God for his father and never want joy. And so Tom awoke and arose in the dark and got with our bags and brushes to work. Though the morning was cold, Tom was happy and warm. So if all do their duty, they need not fear harm. And so this is kind of a dark, really commentary on child labor and child abuse during this particular time, where we're putting children in these industries and we're exploiting their labor. Another major problem during this time was prostitution. When you have low wages and high rent, you have extreme, desperate situations. And Thomas Hardy is really one of the first modernist poets, examines this in what he calls the ruined maid. He says, "O Malia, my dear, does this everything crown? Who could I suppose should meet you in town? And whence shines fair grace shuts prosperity," right? So she sees Malia and she's like, "Wow, where'd you get all this money?" She says, "Oh, didn't you know I'd been ruined?" said she. You left us in tatters, without shoes or socks, tired of digging potatoes and spudding up docks. And now you've gay bracelets and bright feathers 3. Yes, that's how we dress when we're ruined, said she. At home in the barton you said thee and thou, and think un and thees un and the other, but now your talking quite fits thee of high company. Some polish is gained when one's ruined, said she. Your hands were like pawns then, your face bleak and blue and bleak, but now I'm bewitched by your delicate cheek, and your little gloves fit as on any lady. We never do work when we're ruined, said she. You used to call home life a hag-ridden dream, and you'd sigh and you'd sock, but at present you seem to not know of megrims or melancholy. True, one's pretty lively when ruined, said she. I wish I had feathers, a fine sweeping gown, and a delicate face, and could strut about town. My dear, a raw country girl, such as you be, cannot quite expect that. You ain't ruined, said she. And so one of the major problems that we have with this urbanization is this rise of prostitution, that women are entering into this workforce by desperation, right? And so we see that with Malia, she gains some refinement, she gains some wealth, she gains some access. But again, the question that we have within the poem is, at what cost, right? And we kind of have this interesting kind of morality at the end where the narrator who's looking at her says is that she wishes she could be so refined. And so thinking about Marx, right, capitalism produces the lowest amount of sum. The only way out of this, right, according to this particular poem, the argument is we might need to cut some corners, right? So there's that desperation that we see happening. Another problem is alcoholism is on the rise during this time, where we see people turning to alcohol in order to cope from the massive problems. The absinthe drinker here that we see with Degas, who comes into this bar and she has this kind of deadened look in her eye. Downtrodden, beat down by modern industrial life, that it's not this perfect panacea, that's not this perfect hope. Maybe humanity's not heading in the right direction. Absinthe is a very potent alcohol made from wormwood that is almost like a narcotic, and it's actually illegal anywhere else in the world except for England. But it's very cheap, and so it's something that the poor would use and to escape their plight. And so maybe, right, getting back to Marx's ideas, maybe this isn't the perfect panacea. That kind of thinking about these ideas, right, about pollution. John Ruskin's The Storm Cloud of the 20th Century, he examines this industrial world and he suggests that maybe there's some problems here. He says, in the old days when weather was fine, it was luxuriously fine. When it was bad, it was abnormally bad, but it had its fits of temper and was done with it. It didn't sulk for 3 months without letting you see the sun. And so he takes a look at this idea of pollution in industry, and these clouds are just constantly looming over. For the sky is covered with gray cloud, not rain cloud, but a dry black veil, which no ray of sunshine can pierce. Partly diffused in mist, feeble mist, enough to make distant objects unintelligible, yet without any substance or wreathing or its color of its own. And so he suggests that there's this major pollution due to industry, that maybe this industry is not this perfect panacea that we see. Maybe there's some unintended consequences that we need to consider. So kind of interesting that even in the 19th century, they were concerned with pollution and what's happening with industrialization. Taking a look, I wanted to just kind of briefly go through some of Paul Tudor's ideas in his talk, We Need to Rethink Capitalism.
I started in my 20s trading commodities, cotton in particular, in the pits. And if there was ever a free market free-for-all, this was it, where men wearing ties but acting like gladiators fought literally and physically for a profit. Now, fortunately, I was good enough that by the time I was 30, I was able to move into the upstairs world of money management, where I spent the next 3 decades as a global macro trader. And over that time, I've seen a lot of crazy things in the markets, and I've traded a lot of crazy manias. And unfortunately, I'm sad to report that right now we might be in the grips of one of the most disastrous, certainly, of my career. And one consistent takeaway is manias never end well. Now, over the past 50 years, we as a society have come to view our companies and corporations in a very narrow, almost monomaniacal fashion with regard to how we value them. And we have put so much emphasis on profits, our short-term quarterly earnings and share prices, at the exclusion of all else. It's like we've ripped the humanity out of our companies. Now, we don't do that, conveniently reduce something to a set of numbers that you can play with like Lego toys.
I'm going to leave off there, but he comes from the world of finance and capitalism, very successful, and he suggests that what we need to do is we need to find ways for businesses to reintroduce humanity into them in order to combat a lot of the massive poverty that we are seeing today. Taking a look at, just kind of going through these next two ideas quickly here, Darwin, and then we'll take a look at Nietzsche. Again, what I want you to think about is, as we go through these intellectual ideas, is what truths do you see, right? He argues that each species tends by its geometrical ratio of reproduction to increase inordinately in number, as the modified descendants of each species will be enabled to increase so much the more as they become more diversified in habits and structure. So what he argues here is that the more diverse an organism can be, the more it can fill diverse lands, right? So the more diverse a rabbit can be, the more it can fill, the entire North America. So as being able to seize many on many and widely different places in the economy of nature. And he says that there will be a constant tendency in the natural selection to preserve the most divergent offspring of any one species. And so he suggests that when a species, the weaker species tend to die off, and we see this often in nature. If you just watch the Nature Channel or something like that, generally the big cats on the savannah, right, that are taking a look at a gazelle or something, a wildebeest, they generally are looking for the smallest and the weakest, right? Because the strongest ones are too difficult to take down. And as you take a look at them, as there's this competition within nature, generally the ones that reproduce are going to be the strongest ones that kind of, it's a winner take all as they clash, right? As the rams clash during breeding season, or deers clash during breeding season. Generally the winner is going to take all. And so kind of interesting. And taking a look at Genesis 1:22, and God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply and fill the waters of the sea and let the fowl multiply the earth. And I wonder if Darwin is kind of hitting upon some interesting ideas. And he travels to South America on the ship called the Beagle. And he goes to Galapagos Islands, and he starts to see some species he's never seen before, and he starts to come up with these ideas of, wait, how did these beings come to be? And he starts questioning this idea of creation. But I want us to think about how also, as he's questioning this, there also might be some truth to what he's saying that actually does mesh with creation. He says, new and improved varieties will inevitably supplant and exterminate the older, less improved and indeterminate varieties, and thus species are rendered less, to a large extent, defined and distinct objects. Dominant species belonging to larger groups tend to give birth to new and dominant forms, so that each large group tends to become larger still, and at the same time more divergent in character. And so the more we're able to kind of have more diverse genetics and stronger genetics, the more we're able to become more resistant to things out there. An example of this was the potato famine in Ireland, where they were cloning one particular potato, which was really large. But when a fungus came through one year, it wiped out that one particular potato, and they lost the entire crop. Whereas if they had a diverse potato that they were growing, it would have hit that one particular potato, and it would have left everyone else alone. And so he suggests that we need to have more of diversity within our genes, and that will give us stronger characteristics. And he talks about this idea of selective breeding that is kind of important, that I think is interesting, that it's recorded in Genesis 30 as well. And it came to pass whensoever the strong cattle did conceive, that Jacob laid the rods before the eyes of the cattle in the gutters, that they might conceive among the rods. But when the cattle were feeble, he put them not in. And so here we see Jacob, who is using selective breeding in order to preserve the most strongest amount of genes. And here's kind of this idea brought to science, right? They're going to take this idea of selective breeding and apply it to cattle.
In the cowshed, the man in charge of the beef herd is
Belgian
something
blues.
so big.
He's a big fellow. Am I all right?
He's quite big, huh? He's 160 meter tall, yeah.
If I saw a man like that,
Yeah.
but I wouldn't get this close to him, I don't think. I would think he was on steroids or something. I think
No.
he was a bodybuilder.
It is 100% natural, whereby, let's say, within so many generations, all breeders have taken the best of the best, or the more muscle of the more muscle. We moved from a normal classical type of animal, and then we select that sort of animal based on the double muscle.
And when you say double muscle,
So this
do
is
you mean it?
kind of, Darwin's idea on steroids. I mean, it's not literal steroids because they're not really using steroids. They're just using selective breeding. But it's this idea of, taking the strongest features and then breeding those features to create stronger and stronger individuals. The main conclusion that Darwin argues is this. He says, the main conclusion here arrived at and now held by many naturalists who are well competent to form a sound judgment is that man is descended from some less highly organized form. He is not content to look like a savage at the phenomenon of nature, as disconnected cannot any longer believe that man is the work of a separate act of creation. And so this idea that he throws out there is going to heavily influence the writers and the artists of his day. It's going to show a very different idea of where humanity comes from and where and what we're all about. Herbert Spencer kind of perverts this idea a little bit, but it's the application of Darwin's ideas to humans and society. Embraces the idea of the survival of fittest, and it suggests that the rich have evolved better than the poor in social welfare and hinders the natural process of evolution, limiting society's ability to weed out the weak. And so he kind of takes this idea and applies it to society and suggests that the wealthy individuals must be somehow better equipped or better adapt in order to become better. So he's kind of taking a look at this idea of capitalism and suggests that we need to completely eliminate the poor because they haven't evolved well enough. But it's just kind of this idea of applying Darwin's ideas to other aspects. And extreme views of social Darwinism argues that developed nations are better and more evolved than undeveloped, and extreme views. So this is going to be kind of a perversion of Darwin's ideas that is going to take place in the 20th century. It suggests that it's a moral responsibility of the developed nation to civilize others even by force. And so this is taking Marx's idea of capitalism, right? Capitalism is seeking to force its ideas onto other nations to bring quote-unquote civilization, right? So now they're using Darwin as a justification for that poor behavior. Eugenics is another problem that we see with Darwin. Eugenics, or the perversion of Darwin's ideas, the application of the evolution of race, that some races are more evolved than others, is another extreme view that stems from these ideas. Eugenics seeks to weed out undesirable or multiple multiple desirable traits in humans, and so Hitler is going to pick up on this. And that's not to suggest that Darwin's ideas are flawed or problematic. Is to suggest that people can take an idea and they can pervert that idea to other ways. And so we see during the 20th century, people start to take his ideas to the extreme and to pervert them to very negative ends. I just want to throw that out there, so we don't get distracted by some of the problems that are out there that you can hear about and say, well, what about this? Doesn't Darwin support this? Well, no, actually Darwin doesn't support this. He actually takes a look at some other ideas, mainly focusing on biology. He does have some kind of radical ideas that do kind of lead into this. But let's just take a look at his ideas and how his ideas are mainly developing a different understanding of the human condition. taking a look at, let's leave off with Friedrich Nietzsche and the gay science. What he argues within this is a different view of humanity. A lot of people take a look at Nietzsche's ideas and they just kind of give him the moniker God is dead, right? That's kind of his main, that's what's generally attributed to Nietzsche. But a lot of people just really, they don't look at the ideas of Marx. They never read Marx, they never read Darwin, and they never read Nietzsche, right? They just say, well, these are the ideas, right? The general ideas of them. But I feel like we actually need to take a look at the words to see what are they actually saying, right? That's kind of the humanist perspective, is to actually go back to take a look at the words to understand the original intent. And here's what he says. And he's taking a look at the 19th century and how that the 19th century, with the development of science, the development of industry, the extreme emphasis on wealth, that we're losing our connection to God, and we're losing our spirituality, and that's a great concern, right? So his idea of God is dead is less of a celebration that God is dead, it's more of a mourning, right? So we see that here. He says, have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran into the marketplace and cried incessantly, I seek God, I seek God. As many of those who did not believe in God were standing around just then, he provoked much laughter. Has he got lost? Asked one. Did he lose his way like a child? Asked another. Or is he hiding? Is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a voyage, immigrated? Thus they yelled and they laughed. The madman jumped in their midst and pierced them with his eyes. Whither is God? He cried. I will tell you. We have killed him, you and I. What were we doing when we enchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all the suns? Are we not plunging continually, backwards, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there not any up or down? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night continually closing in on us? Do we not need to light lanterns in the morning? Do we hear nothing as yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we smell nothing as yet of the divine decomposition? God too decomposes, God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him, right? So this idea that God is dead, first of all, it's an absurd idea, because if God's there, can't die, right? God's not there, he can't die, right? What he's suggesting here is that God has lost relevance in the modern world. And I want you to think about whether there's truth in that, right? And as we remove God, right, the concern that Nietzsche promotes is where are we moving to now? It used to be that we're moving by divine direction, by providence. If you remove God, the scary thing is what's directing humanity? And the answer is humanity. And to him, right, the vices, the natural man, the problems of humanity, that's a scary thing. If you remove God from the equation, then we feel as though we're moving nowhere, right, into this infinite nothing. And so that's what he's concerned with. He's concerned that we've started to lose our sense. We've started to lose our direction. So what we see with this view of humanity, just to kind of close here, is a very different idea than what we see during the Victorian era. Even though these ideas are emerging from the Victorian era, they're suggesting that there's some problems on the horizon. Even though each one of them, right? Marx argues that we're living in a corrupt world of capitalism, but eventually one day we'll get to communism and we'll live better, right? Darwin says that we're probably not the best that we are now, but we're evolving to become better, right? Nietzsche argues that we're not really in a good state right now, but through the Übermensch, or the overman, he's going to guide us and direct us towards a better ideal. And so each of them kind of have that Victorian hope embedded within their ideas. But what we see is a different view of humanity, that humanity isn't necessarily virtuous or noble or, godlike. More along the lines is that we're more animal-like, that we behave more like animals, that this idea of capitalism is that we live in a dog-eat-dog world. We're trying to defeat the enemy of our competitors. Or with Darwin, we see that life is a struggle for survival, and only the strongest will survive. Right? This is a very different kind of mindset. What we see with Nietzsche is that humanity is losing its spirituality, and so when we take a look at art of the modern world, art always reflects the world it was created in. Art's going to look different, because the understanding of humanity is vastly different than it was before. We don't really see humanity in the same way. And so It might look ugly, as we see here with George Gross, which we have kind of these machines and these other elements that are changing and distorting the human face. But he's suggesting that we've become more machine-like, that we're losing our humanity. Or as we see with Egon Schiele, the self-portrait here, he's skinny, right? He's kind of borderline starvation, that humanity is withering away. And so they're not necessarily celebrating this representation of humanity. They're actually concerned about it. They're concerned about the direction of where we're going because of capitalism. They're concerned about the direction that we're going because of this idea of survival of the fittest, that we're acting more like animals than we are like divine individuals. And they're concerned with this idea that we're losing our spirituality. And so their art is a reflection of the ugliness of the world that they find themselves in, to perhaps act as a wake-up call for us to perhaps act a little better. And the question is whether this is relevant, right? Some people argue, why do we take a look at this kind of art? It's just ugly. We should just look at beautiful things. But I wonder if there's value in taking a look at, as you're holding a mirror up to our world, to taking a good look at our social values and thinking about whether we need to change them.